Good morning, everyone. In the previous module, Professor Sir Mr. Patnaik has covered on the aspects of environmentalism of the poor. In this module, I'll cover about tribal ecology, state, and development in India. As a foundations, I want to take you all through to a very powerful Native American quote. It says, "When the blood in your veins return to the sea, and the earth in your bones return to the ground, perhaps then you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is you who belong to this land." In fact, I want you to all to reflect on this powerful quote for a few minutes and also see in the context of Indian society. This, in fact, has become the foundations of tribal philosophy in the context of environment and also the land. Here, if we take the example of tribes in India, land is not a mere commodity. In fact, land is being treated as alive, and the issues of the livelihood revolves around the questions of land. How do we treat land? For instance, the concept of this secret grove in many of the tribal territories. But before I discuss in land, I wanted to bring you to your attention in the context of, who are tribes in India? What is their relation with nature and their ecology? Do tribes have intrinsic relation with nature? Are tribal systems of governance, tradition, and customary laws hurdle for development and combating climate change in India, or vice versa? What happens when state and other agencies appropriate tribal jal, jungle, and jamin? Why do tribal protests on mega infrastructure development projects located in their territory? So broadly in this lecture, I will take you through to the concepts of tribes and also their surroundings, their environment. What is and what are or how are they related to their ecology? What kind of responses emerges from tribal perspective? What happened to the questions of development in today's context? If we look at is the contemporaneous development practices in the context of India, tribes are in fact, some people went to the extent of calling tribes as anti-development or tribe as anti-state because they protest against large mega infrastructure which indeed takes away their livelihood. So the questions which we need to reframe and ask ourselves is that why do tribe protest in the manner they are protesting? Is it to do with the livelihood or are they really against development? In fact, many research have shown us that tribes are protesting because they are not against development per se, but they are in fact protesting the nature of development that displaces their their home, their livelihood, submerges their agriculture activities, and so on and so forth. But before going to that aspect, let us try to understand the concept of tribes in the context of India. Broadly, one can look at three broad perspectives in order to understand tribes in India. One is that of the colonial framework, or what on the other in other words it's called the evolutionary perspective. The second is on the caste perspective of understanding tribes. Of course, the emerging and the third perspective is from within. Here, one can broadly also categorize in the aspects of perspective from above, perspective from below, and perspective from within. If we look at perspective from above, it stems from the Western or the colonial perspective of understanding tribes. On the other hand, if we look at the perspective from below, it stems from what is called the subaltern studies. For instance, how do colonial anthropologists or the colonial administrators or from the evolutionary perspective look at the concept of tribes? So for them, tribes as defendant forest dwellers, savages, primitive, half naked, uncivilized, backward, and so on and so forth. They view tribe as incapable of producing or partaking in knowledge productions. So the question one might raise is that what about the indigenous knowledge of preserving our ecology? Can we learn a lesson or two from the perspective emerging from the tribe itself? But on the other hand, if we look at theoretically from the colonial or evolutionary perspective, they're being treated as half naked. They're being treated as savages. They're being termed as people without history or incapable of producing knowledge. Here, we need to critically look at those perspectives and questions. How did this colonial or the evolutionary perspective comes to such a conclusions? Is that perspective or is their perspective in a way emancipating? Or are tribe trapped within the perspective or the colonial or this colonial or evolutionary perspective? This is the question I want you all to reflect. On the other hand, talking about tribes, there is also an emerging perspective. Of course, it's been very dominant from the sociological point of view or sociological perspective. That is none other than what is called the caste perspective. For instance, Professor G.S. Gure went on to the extent of calling tribes as backward Hindus. Tribes are seen as caste-like entities, or in other words, caste-centric perspective of tribal studies. That is, tribes' transformation into caste. How much transformation has taken place among the tribal society so that they become more like a caste society? Indeed, even this perspective we need to caution. Our tribal transformation is all about transforming into a caste society? Aren't tribes have their own agency? The kind of social changes taking place among tribal society, is that similar to that of a caste? Here we need to question that aspects. So the third perspective is what we call perspective from within, emerging from tribal intellectual collective in India. In fact, if we look at this perspective, it is very different from that of caste or colonial or what we call this evolutionary perspective. In this, tribes are considered as a society like any other societies. Tribe as a society with a definite area or territoriality, language, cultural homogeneity, and unified social organization. That's what Professor Kaka in fact look at and conceptualize tribes. Or in other words, one can simply put in tribe as noun caste society, different from that of caste society. And if we look at some of the features, tribes are in fact relatively egalitarian within the groups. And there is an absence of complex political structures, strong and functional kingship bonds, cooperation, territorial integrity, cultural and linguistic distinctiveness, and intrinsic relation with nature. That's what Professor Virginus Kaka in fact puts into and understand the very category of tribes in India, which indeed deviated away from that of caste perspective or the evolutionary perspective of understanding tribes in India. Having had this brief theoretical backdrop, now I'll go to the aspects of, what is the relationship between tribals and their environment. Is there a lesson or two we can learn about in these very aspects of tribal relations with their environment? Here, the culture of a community is shaped by the environment on the one hand, and on the other hand, human beings too have an impact on the environment. The way tribes treat their forests, their resources, their land, it's not merely an commodity. In fact, their belief systems, their culture, their understanding also are also shaped by the environment which they are in. And indeed, when we look at these contemporaneous development practices, there is a rapid advances and drive for economic growth, which have been at the cost of natural resources. So what happened when there is an aggressive push for development or aggressive push for economic growth? What happened to the questions of environment? Here, we might like to reflect about, are there traditional ways of preserving our environment? What are the unique techniques which tribals in the context of India uses it? Say, techniques based on traditional knowledge systems are being sought as development alternative intervention for sustainable development. So what are those traditional knowledges? If we look at some of the tribal society, for instance, the Nagas in northeast India, there are some tribe which practices zoom cultivations. Indeed, if we look at the cycle of zoom cultivations, is as such that it takes nearly 15 to 16 years to come back to the same spot to cultivate. They look at about the surroundings to see whether the land has been fertile to cultivate in such a way that causing the least environmental destructions. So tribal ways of dealing with nature can be seen as one alternative to climate change and also environmental destructions. One may note that many mega infrastructure development projects are coming up in these tribal territories. So the questions over here is that what are those traditional knowledge systems, their practice of agriculture in search of their livelihood? And if we look at it, tribes in India historically follow what is called this subsistence economy, not for surplus production, not for market, but for self-consumption. Of course, this way of livelihood is fast changing. In fact, when what Professor Varginas Kaka look at the relationship of tribe with nature in two ways. The first aspect is from this cultural domain, and the second is in the aspects of livelihood. The way in which nature and the environment are articulated and represented in riddles, stories, myths, legends, feasts, and festivals. Those are, in fact, constitute what is called these cultural domains. They're rich narrative, rich folk tales, folklore, wherein tribes indeed dedicate or derive that knowledge from the natures. Their festivals also surrounds on the aspects of the environment where they live, and also their agriculture activities. And most of the tribal festivals, in fact, revolves on these agricultural seasons. So the way in which the tribes relate with nature and the environment in their day-to-day existence, that is the existent conditions of their living. Where do they get their livelihood? How do tribes depends their livelihood? So nature, environment is the basic provider of their existence. So many tribes in India still live primarily off the land and forest. That's what Professor Varginas Kaka has been arguing. Till today, there are many communities that depends their livelihood, their culture, their belief systems derive from land and forest. Here, if we look at in this photo, this is the secret grove located in Shillong. And in fact, in this secret grove, nobody, no one is allowed to cut even a branch of a tree. Even though the branch of a tree might fall off, people are not even allowed to collect that branch. So it's responding to how the ecosystems. The questions again, what is secret growth? A secret grove is often a dense cluster of trees that is considered to be the abode of the guardian spirit of the villages. Such attitude and worldviews of tribes help to maintain and conserve the natural environment. Here is one secret grove example, the photo which you can see, as I say, in Maupland, located in Shillong, the secret grove. In this aspect, tribal's dependence on the natural environment, as we were talking about, it's both subsistence based and cultural conservation practices. Among them indicate an obligation towards the environment, which is carried out in many ways. One of the practice in terms of conserving the environment is the concept of the secret growth. In fact, Professor Virginis Kaka has beautifully conceptualized what is secret growth. Given this aspect, the harmony between the natural and the social worlds that the tribes had maintained for centuries was ruptured during the colonial period. This has much to do with the forest policy of the colonial state. And here we might go back and revisit or historicize what are those colonial forest policy? What are the ramifications in terms of forest policy in the context of our environment? And particularly here, we are discussing about tribes in the context of India. The kind of the policy in place, it's not much to do with the conservation, rather for profit making. And the huge deforestation, cutting down of trees in order to convert those resources into a profit making business. So if you're interested now in more in terms of the forest policy of during the colonial period, there is an article which I will put up in this lecture. You can explore that aspects. Not only during the colonial period, even in post-colonial development aspects, nature in fact represents a torrent of politicizations by which tribal communities contest state developmentalisms, extractive economies, and military paramilitary violence. In this aspect, in terms of these extractive economies and also nexus between various stakeholders, there are ample of example one we can take from any tribal territories. For instance, if you look in the context of Northeast, the number of mega hydropower projects coming up or in the pipeline, and also the kind of displacement, the volume is so large, even in this context of this post-colonial development approach. Why it has become a terrain of politicization is as such that it boils down to the question of land control and also tribal livelihoods. We can take the example from other parts of the country, say for instance, even in Chhattisgarh, in Orissa, in Jharkhand, in Madhya Pradesh, wherever one can find about the sizable populations of tribes, one can see about the kind of politicizations in the territory. Coming to these aspects of tribal ecologies, I wanted to take you through one very powerful quote by a tribal name called Tuisam Nakham. He said that we have a sacred responsibility to care for the land. The land belongs to me. I belong to the land, and I am the land, and the land is me. We are inseparable. Remember when we started our lecture, the Native American quotes, that indeed I belongs to the land. This in fact echoes similar perspective. And in order to understand tribal ecology, we need to understand the very category of land. How do tribe conceptualize land? Is land a mere commodity or was much more than that? So look at the way how tourism conceptualize, saying that the land belongs to me and I belong to the land. I am the land and the land is me. We are inseparable. Such a beautiful concept of land. So in this aspect, Body and me try to conceptualize, land from the theoretical perspective. Land indeed is the ontological core of tribes' being and fullness. Without land, there is no tribal identity. There is so the tribes' being and the fullness of tribes, in fact, it stems from the very category of land. That's why it is called, the ontological core. Land indeed constitute the bedrock of tribal identities. In fact, tribe tends to treat their non-human surroundings, especially their land, water, and forest, as living entities and mostly as part of their being or sometimes as an extension of themselves if so. Indeed, land is being conceptualized as being alive. So what in the Tuisms was arguing that I am the land and the land is me. We are inseparable. In that aspect, land is also being considered as being alive. So here, land, territory, and how they are interconnected. Territory is generally holistic and constitutes hills, rivers, natural and mineral resources, air, water, and people who firstly inhabit it. So, if we try to understand the concepts of territory from the tribal perspective, it's indeed constitute of everything and about their surrounding. So here, Taiko, on the other hand, also conceptualized the human as an interconnected web of relationship with all living and non-living beings, and recognizes that their survival depends on how they interact with each other and everything around them. The way how human beings, the way how tribal interact with their surroundings, how the very concept of culture, their identity, their folk song, their folk tales, in terms of traditional knowledge, conserving of natural resources, conserving of their ecology, stem from these interconnections or the interrelationship between living and non-living beings. That's where it made sense that I am the land and the land is me. The land as being alive. The land as the ontological core of tribals being and fullness. So given these aspects of this land, you know, as I said, land is not a mere commodity, but conceived as being alive. If you look at the photos over here, that's the kind of this agriculture prac- practices by the Naga tribes located in Manipur, which is called these terrace paddy field cultivations. So the way they treat their paddy field, it's not mere commodity. It is for their survival. So land for them will conceive as being alive and not just mere commodity. For tribes, the land is sacred in itself, and their identity, culture, and tradition stems from it. That's what Bodhi and me are trying to argue in our book on the context of land. So Simre in 2012 also articulated in a similar manner, wherein he argued that the land is more than a habitat or political boundary. The land and local environment, particularly the forests, are the basis of Naga's social, cultural, and economic systems. This is in fact related to the kind of relationship between the living and non-living, and also about the political boundaries and their territory, the unique conceptions of territory, the geography, it's all stem from land. Tribals, in fact, have an intrinsic symbiotic connection between their identity, land, territoriality, and natures. Say their beliefs, rituals, culture, etc., are all linked to tribal perceptions of nature. How do they treat nature? Interestingly, in Lind, 1967 argued what people do about their ecology depends on what they think about themselves in relation to things around them. So let us take a moment and reflect on these very conceptions of land and what do we do to our ecology? How are we treating our ecosystems, the nature? What is our relationships? What are the roles and responsibility we have in terms of, say, for instance, combating climate change? Can we take some examples of tribes having a symbiotic connections with nature? And here is again that beautiful photo, which is called this double deck living root bridge in Meghalaya. Here, Khasis did not use any concrete to build this living root bridge. In fact, it's the way how they understand their nature, their environment, and the kind of these knowledge systems wherein, they build a bridge. In fact, it's also attract lots of tourists. If you ever visit Shillong, Meghalaya, please go and visit this Living Roots Bridge. It's standing tall for more than centuries. The kind of knowledge systems which they derive, and in fact, the natures work wonder in these aspects without using any concrete, without using what is called the sophisticated modern advanced technology. And this is indeed an environment friendly interventions in terms of what I call this indigenous knowledge. Or in other words, how tribal have this symbiotic relation with nature. And this is the living example right in front of us. And in contrast, if we look at what's happening in this contemporaneous development approach of the state, this on this photo in fact depict about the constructions of highway in the frontiers. If we look at about the infrastructure in development and ecology in tribal area, this is again another example that there is an aggressive push for mega infrastructure development in tribal areas, and it have an adverse environmental consequences. So the question arises, how do we balance the need for development on the one hand and also conservations of our environment? Can we draw a balance? Can we think of an alternative development that also take care the questions of sustainability, the questions of environment friendly? So in the context of northeastern state, there is a securitization of development, and the questions of development with justice became, the fundamental issue. The massive push for mega infrastructure development and the displacement of the locals. And on the other hand, if we talk about development with justice in as such, how do we balance those aspects? Can we think of development that addresses the historically discriminated communities, that addresses the rights of the people who live at the margin of the society? So having said that, in the contemporaneous development practice and approach of the state, tribal knowledge systems, traditional institutions, and their ecology take a backseat. So can we revisit those traditional knowledge systems? The traditional institutions that promote sustainability, that promotes and that, address the questions of injustice, environmental injustice. So can we learn a lesson and revisit those aspects and incorporate that in our contemporaneous development practices? So here, tribals continue to be treated as mere recipients of the so-called modern knowledge and beneficiaries of welfare measures only, rather than as part of this knowledge ecosystem. So the challenge over here is that how can we integrate the traditional knowledge systems that promote sustainability, that work towards equality into the so-called modern development approach of the state that in fact will take care about the questions of justice, question of sustainability. And if we look at this aggressive push for mega infrastructure development, this approach is indeed antithesis to tribal epistemology and amount to what is called epistemicides. So here, we need to foreground the traditional knowledge systems that promotes equality, that addresses the environmental injustice. Against this backdrop, I want you all to, if you get time, to see a very, to listen to a song called, We Will Not Leave Our Village